Hey guys, tonight we embark on a journey that might make you profoundly grateful for your modern comforts, from your memory foam mattress to that quiet humming refrigerator. Before we fully embark on tonight's journey through the untamed American frontier, a simple gesture can help us continue these explorations. If you genuinely find peace and insight in what we do here, a quiet subscribe and a little like mean a lot. And we always appreciate a brief note in the comments sharing where you're listening from, perhaps a quiet corner of the world far removed from the dusty trails we're about to explore. Now dim the lights. Perhaps let the soft hum of your fan fill the silence, and prepare to drift into a world that for most of us exists only in the sepia-toned pages of history books and the flickering shadows of Hollywood films. Tonight, we're peeling back those layers of romanticized myth carefully, gently to reveal the true, gritty, and often profoundly dangerous reality of the Wild West. We're stepping beyond the charming cowboy, the valiant lawman, and the spirited pioneer woman of celluloid, and into a landscape where survival was never ever guaranteed. It was indeed truly wild. Our central thesis for the evening, if you can call it that, is a simple one. Most of us living in our air-conditioned, sanitized, digitally connected world would likely not survive even a single day in the untamed American frontier of the 1870s. And we're going to start your brief hypothetical and ultimately very uncomfortable stay, not with a thrilling shootout or a grand adventure, but with something far more fundamental. Something that would hit you the moment you quite literally opened your eyes, the pervasive, inescapable, and often profoundly offensive smells of the past. Your journey into the reality of the Wild West begins not with a bang, but with a deeply unsettling assault on your senses. Imagine for a moment waking in a sod hut or a rough-hewn log cabin, the first sliver of dawn barely touching the horizon. You stretch, perhaps, and immediately your nostrils are assailed by an aroma that defies pleasant description. This isn't the crisp, clean scent of a mountain pine forest or the fresh, earthy perfume of a spring rain. No. This is a pungent, heavy mixture, a constant companion to frontier life composed of unwashed bodies, animal droppings, raw sewage, and the lingering acrid tang of wood smoke and stale cooking grease. This was the ever-present atmospheric signature of the era, the air you would breathe day in and day out. Bathing as you know it with hot running water, fluffy towels, and fragrant soaps was an unimaginable luxury. For most frontier settlers, a proper bath was at best a monthly occurrence, often far less frequently. Some individuals, particularly during the brutal winter months when water froze and fuel was precious, went entire seasons without a full immersive cleansing. The very idea of using valuable water so desperately needed for drinking and cooking for something as frivolous as personal hygiene was often unthinkable. You might rinse your face, perhaps, or wash your hands, but that deeply ingrained fundamental grime, it would cling to you like a second skin, a constant reminder of your place in the rough hierarchy of the wild. And as you grapple with the olfactory challenges of your new reality, your body accustomed to a life of comfortable chairs and minimal exertion would immediately protest. Life in the Wild West for the common person was a relentless dawn-to-dusk physical exertion. There were no weekends, no holidays, no ergonomic considerations, no sick days. Your body was your primary tool, whether you were a farmer breaking stubbornly thick prairie sod, a miner chipping away at rock deep underground, or a ranch hand wrestling with obstinate cattle. It was used quite simply until it broke down. The long-term effects of such ceaseless toil were evident in every hardened settler. Even the strongest individuals by their early 30s were often permanently hunched, their joints gnarled and arthritic, their hands calloused and cracked beyond recognition. Imagine spending 14 hours plowing fields under a relentless sun, or hauling countless buckets of water from a distant well, or chopping a winter's worth of wood, each swing of the axe a deliberate, exhausting effort. This constant, unyielding physical demand was directly correlated to the grim reality of the average lifespan, which hovered around a sobering 35 years. The body, simply put, could only take so much. The environment itself offered little respite. Consider the interior of your frontier cabin in the depths of winter. The outdoor temperature might plummet to what we would consider a polite couple of degrees above freezing, but inside, with fireplaces often allowed to burn down overnight to conserve precious fuel, the air could easily drop to 20 degrees below freezing. You would wake to frost-rimmed windows, your breath misting in the frigid air, the very water in your washing basin frozen solid. There was no central heating, no thermal underwear, no down comforters. You wore everything you owned and shivered. In stark contrast, summer brought its own brutal torments. The sun beat down, turning the uninsulated cabins into ovens. You would sweat through all your clothing constantly, ceaselessly, with no escape from the relentless heat, save for the brief shade of a tree itself, a luxury in many regions. The elements were not something you visited. They were something you lived inside of an ever-present demanding companion. And the clothing you wore, far from the dashing clean outfits you might see in a Western film, it was profoundly impractical and uncomfortable. Men typically owned only 2 sets of clothes, rough canvas or denim pants, and coarse cotton shirts that chafed against the skin, especially when wet with sweat or stiff with grime. For women, the situation was even more arduous. They wore multiple layers: chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long, heavy dresses, regardless of the temperature. These garments were often scratchy, ill-fitting, and like all other clothing, rarely cleaned. Imagine the discomfort, the constriction, the sheer weight of these layers, every single day, every single hour. Your clothes were not a statement of fashion, but a testament to necessity designed for durability rather than comfort, and they were in themselves another subtle daily torment. Having confronted the pervasive grime and the physical demands of your new frontier life, let us now consider the very fuel that would sustain, or rather barely sustain, your existence, your diet. Forget the diverse, convenient array of choices found in your modern pantry. Here, the culinary landscape was defined by monotony and nutritional deficiency, a triumvirate of staples that would quickly become wearying beans, biscuits, and coffee. These 3 unassuming items often served as the core of every single meal day after day, week after week. Fresh fruits and vegetables. Those vibrant sources of essential vitamins and minerals were exceptionally rare seasonal luxuries, cherished and devoured quickly when they appeared only to disappear again for months. Meat, when available, was almost always preserved with copious amounts of salt or smoke, a necessity born from the complete absence of refrigeration. This process, while preventing immediate spoilage, rendered the meat tough, often stringy, and sometimes, despite best efforts, still subtly spoiled. Imagine the texture, the pervasive saltiness, and the sheer lack of variety that would define every bite you took. This stark reality of a limited diet led to widespread nutritional deficiencies, the kind that modern medicine has all but eradicated. Scurvy, for instance, a condition that sounds like something pulled from a pirate novel, was distressingly common. Your gums would bleed, your teeth would loosen and eventually fall out. Your joints would ache with a dull, persistent pain, and left untreated, it would lead to death. And all of this simply because your body lacked a consistent supply of vitamin C. It's a preventable disease easily remedied with a daily orange or a few berries, but in the Wild West, such simple solutions were often beyond reach. And the coffee, that vital elixir of frontier life, was typically boiled to within an inch of its life. It was a dark, bitter brew sometimes with crushed eggshells or even a pinch of salt added not for flavor, but in a desperate, often futile attempt to reduce its harsh bitterness. It was less a morning pick-me-up and more a warm, vaguely caffeinated slurry designed to simply exist. Even within the presumed sanctuary of your own dwelling, a new set of daily dangers would present themselves, small, insidious threats born of a wilder world. Imagine rising each morning, a habit born from painful first-hand experience, and before you slide your feet into your boots, you carefully, methodically check the insides for scorpions or snakes. A venomous bite, miles from any semblance of medical help, was not a rare occurrence, but a very real, very present possibility. Your hastily constructed sod or log cabin, built for expediency rather than perfection, would likely have a leaky roof. The sound of rain on the roof wouldn't be soothing. It would be a constant drumbeat forcing you to position buckets and pots to catch the trickling rainwater, not just to protect your meager possessions, but because this caught water might be your primary source of drinking water. Clean water, that seemingly infinite resource we take for granted, was a true scarcity. Reliance on shared water sources, a communal well, a nearby stream or river, meant that the same water used for washing, for livestock, for anything and everything was also the water you drank. This inevitably led to frequent debilitating waterborne illnesses, a constant low-level war waged in your intestines. Dysentery, typhoid, and other unseen enemies would routinely sweep through frontier settlements, turning a simple glass of water into a roll of the dice. Venturing beyond your small, often damp and subtly dangerous cabin, you would encounter the peculiar chaos of the unsanitary and perilous frontier town. These nascent settlements, unlike the carefully planned grids of older cities, grew haphazardly with buildings constructed wherever convenient, often without any semblance of order or long-term vision. The streets themselves were not paved but merely dirt tracks transforming with the seasons. A heavy rain would turn them into knee-deep mud pits, sucking at your worn boots with every step, making travel a slog. In dry spells, these same tracks became suffocating dust bowls, the fine particles coating everything and everyone in a uniform layer of gritty brown. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, was horse manure. Piles of it fresh and dried in various states of decomposition. There were no street cleaners, no sanitation departments, no municipal efforts to manage the sheer volume of animal waste that was an inescapable part of daily life. And it attracted flies, swarms of them, buzzing, landing, and carrying whatever microscopic horrors they had picked up. These towns, then, were veritable hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage systems, without any understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread with horrifying rapidity. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were not abstract threats, but common, devastating realities capable of wiping out half a town's population in a matter of weeks. You might go to sleep in a community teeming with life, only to wake a few days later to a chilling silence, the air thick with the scent of sickness and desperation. The Wild West was in many ways an epidemiological battlefield. As you navigate the perilous streets of a frontier town, your gaze might quite naturally be drawn to the saloon. Forget the grand swinging doors and polished brass you've seen in the movies where sophisticated gentlemen sip whiskey and play high-stakes poker. The reality of a frontier saloon was a far more humble and often much grimmer affair. These were typically crude one-room structures hastily erected with rough plank bars that were probably never properly cleaned and basic, often rickety furniture. The air inside would be thick with the smell of stale tobacco smoke, cheap, potent liquor, and the same underlying human and animal odors that permeated the streets. The light would be dim, cast by flickering oil lamps that coated everything in a fine layer of soot. This was not a place of glamour, but of raw, often desperate escapism. And the liquor itself. It was far from the aged, mellow spirits connoisseurs enjoy today. What passed for whiskey was often raw, unrectified alcohol frequently mixed with an astonishing array of questionable additives. Imagine sipping a drink that might contain tobacco juice, pepper turpentine, or even gunpowder, all intended to provide a kick and mask the truly awful taste of the base spirit. These concoctions were not only unpalatable, but genuinely dangerous, capable of causing blindness or severe internal damage with prolonged consumption. You weren't just risking a hangover. You were risking your eyesight, your liver, your very life with every burning swallow. These establishments were also perhaps unsurprisingly frequent sites of deadly confrontations. Not the formalized, dramatic duels of Hollywood legend, but drunken arguments escalating quickly into messy, impulsive violence in a society where almost everyone was heavily armed. Frontier violence was typically chaotic, brutal, and over trivial matters. A perceived insult, a cheating accusation, a misplaced glance. There was rarely any sense of honor or fairness, just the raw, immediate explosion of rage and the quick, brutal ending of a life. Moving from the social dangers to the physical, consider the state of medical care you would encounter should you fall ill or suffer an injury. The phrase primitive hardly begins to cover it. Most doctors in the Wild West, if you were fortunate enough to find one, had little or no formal training. Their education might consist of a brief apprenticeship, perhaps a few months at a rudimentary medical college, where theories were often as flimsy as the frontier structures themselves. Medical science still largely relied on concepts like humoral balance ideas that would have been more at home in the medieval period than the late 19th century. The vast majority of health issues were addressed through home remedies or folk medicine, some of which offered mild comfort, many of which were utterly ineffective, and some, frankly, were outright harmful. Forget the sterile environment of a modern hospital. Professional care was a distant, often non-existent concept. Should your condition worsen to the point of needing surgery, you would face a truly horrific ordeal. Procedures were performed without anesthesia beyond a hefty dose of whiskey, or if you were lucky, morphine, and even then its administration was imprecise. The pain would be excruciating beyond anything you could imagine. Sterilization. The fundamental principle of modern medicine that prevents infection was virtually unknown. Surgeons, often with unwashed hands and instruments that had been used on multiple patients, would operate in conditions that actively promoted infection. A simple cut could lead to a raging fever pus, and ultimately a painful death. Common treatments were often as dangerous as the illness itself. Bloodletting based on the belief that illness stemmed from an imbalance of humors involved deliberately draining blood from an already weakened patient, often hastening their decline. Purgatives designed to cleanse the body caused severe diarrhea, dehydrating, and further weakening the sick. Poultices, meant to draw out infection, often introduced more. And then there were the medicines. Toxic substances like mercury compounds and arsenic were frequently prescribed, doing far more harm than good, slowly poisoning the patient in the misguided attempt to cure them. Without pharmaceutical regulation commercially sold, medicines varied wildly in potency and contained dangerous contaminants. Patent medicines. Those brightly labeled bottles promising miracle cures were often primarily alcohol offering temporary relief through intoxication rather than any actual cure. The mortality rates from what we now consider routine events were staggering. Childbirth, for instance, carried a mortality rate as high as 1 in 4 in remote areas. Complications, such as breech births or hemorrhage, which are now safely managed in modern hospitals, were almost universally fatal for both mother and child. Imagine the constant fear that must have gripped every pregnant woman, every family awaiting a birth. Dentistry was equally brutal. Any dental issue from a cavity to an abscess often meant years of agonizing pain before the inevitable unanesthetized extraction using crude, rusty tools. A broken bone, a minor cut, or even a bad bruise could lead to amputation or death due to rampant infection, a far cry from the antiseptic clinics of today. Survival in this context depended far more on sheer luck and a robust constitution than on any medical intervention. The adage, "Only the strong survive," was not just a saying. It was a literal brutal truth etched into the landscape of every cemetery plot. Beyond the physical torment and the ever-present threat of disease, a more insidious adversary awaited you in the Wild West, the profound psychological burden of isolation. In our interconnected world, where information is instantaneous and communication boundless, it's difficult to truly grasp the depth of this disconnection. Mail delivery was infrequent, unreliable, often taking weeks or even months for a single letter to reach its destination. Newspapers, when they arrived, were weeks or even months out of date, offering fragmented glimpses of a world that had long since moved on. You lived in an information vacuum, a stark contrast to the constant stream of news and updates that now define our lives. This contributed to a highly localized worldview where distant events seemed abstract, almost fictional, their impact barely registering beyond your immediate vicinity. The psychological toll of this isolation, particularly for women, was crippling. Many women on homesteads went days, weeks, or even months without adult conversation. Their only companions, the relentless wind, the creaking of the cabin, and the demands of their children. This deep, pervasive loneliness, combined with constant work and the unyielding hardships of the environment, often triggered a severe mental affliction known as prairie madness. This wasn't just a quaint historical term. It manifested as severe depression anxiety, and in extreme cases, psychosis, sometimes leading to acts of violence, suicide, or the tragic abandonment of homesteads. Social connections, when they existed, were often miles away, making formal gatherings rare and precious events, mostly limited to church services or seasonal celebrations, that offered brief, desperate respites from the pervasive solitude. Imagine the sheer mental fortitude required to simply exist in such a profoundly disconnected world. And then there were the children. Childhood in the Wild West was a far cry from the sheltered, carefree existence we strive for today. Children as young as 6 or 7 were expected to contribute meaningful, essential work to the household and farm. They weren't just helping out. They were vital members of the labor force responsible for livestock collecting eggs, tending vegetables, and caring for younger siblings. By the age of 10 or 12, boys and girls were working alongside adults, often at nearly adult capacity. Boys would labor in the fields, mastering plows and handling draft animals, while girls acquired complex domestic skills like making clothing from scratch, rendering soap, preserving food for the winter, and managing a household. There was no sheltering from the harsh realities of life. Children witnessed births and deaths, the brutal slaughter of animals, and often violent conflicts. They were exposed to the raw, visceral realities of survival from an incredibly young age, forging a resilience that would be unrecognizable today. Education was limited and inconsistent. Schools, when they existed, typically operated for only a few months out of the year, usually during periods when children weren't needed for critical farm work. A single teacher, often barely older than their pupils, would instruct children of all ages in a single uninsulated room with minimal supplies. Corporal punishment was common, a swift and brutal consequence for any perceived misbehavior. Many children received only the most basic literacy. Their education focused instead on practical survival knowledge, understanding weather patterns, tracking animals, farming techniques, and basic first aid. The formal academics we value so highly were secondary to the immediate tangible skills necessary to stay alive. The most devastating reality, however, was the appallingly high child mortality rate. Approximately 1 in 4 children died before reaching adulthood, with the highest numbers occurring in the first 5 years of life. Preventable diseases like measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough, which we now vaccinate against, without a second thought swept through communities claiming young lives with relentless efficiency. Farm accidents were shockingly common due to the dangerous nature of the work and the complete absence of safety protocols. A misstep near a threshing machine or a startled horse could mean instant death. Child safety as a concept was simply foreign. The psychological impact on parents was profound. They grew up watching siblings die, and often heartbreakingly reused names for subsequent children, a testament to a very different, far more stoic relationship with mortality than we understand today. Finally, consider the omnipresent, terrifying peril of fire and the poor quality of frontier shelter. In a world without electricity, reliance on candles and oil lamps for light was absolute. Every flickering flame, every overturned lamp, every stray spark from a fireplace was a potential catastrophe. A single spark could mean losing absolutely everything: your home, your precious few possessions, your shelter from the elements. There was no fire department to call, no neighbors with hoses. Many frontier towns constructed hastily from wood burned to the ground at least once in their short, violent histories. Entire communities could be wiped out in hours by a fast-moving blaze. Your dwelling itself, whether a sod house on the plains, a log cabin in a forested area, or a simple wooden structure in a burgeoning town, offered minimal protection. These homes were haphazardly constructed from whatever materials were readily available, prioritizing speed and basic function over comfort or safety. They were poorly insulated, meaning the brutal cold of winter would seep in, making internal temperatures barely more bearable than the outside, especially in upper floors or lofts where many families slept. In summer, these same structures would become unbearably hot, trapping the stifling heat inside. Your home was less a sanctuary and more a fragile barrier constantly under assault from the elements and the ever-present threat of accidental incineration. Having established the stark and often grim realities of daily existence in the Wild West, from the pervasive stench to the constant threat of fire, we now turn our gaze outward to a collective narrative of immense peril that defined the era for countless individuals, the act of traveling across the untamed American frontier. This was not the romanticized image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies, serenely gazing at sunsets from their covered wagons. The reality of frontier travel was a far more brutal, uncomfortable, and often fatal undertaking. While the Transcontinental Railroad did exist by the 1870s, connecting east and west, it was an expensive luxury, primarily accessible only to the wealthy or those traveling between major cities. For the vast majority of frontier folk, for those trying to reach new homesteads, relocate for work, or simply visit distant family, travel meant one of three options: by horse, by wagon, or on foot. Each came with its own unique set of hardships. Consider for a moment the horse. Hollywood often portrays the cowboy as effortlessly merging with his mount, a picture of grace and freedom. The reality was less idyllic. Horses were incredibly expensive to buy and maintain, often costing the equivalent of months of wages for an average person. This alone put them out of reach for many. And riding for those who could afford it was no pleasure cruise. Saddles were designed for function and durability, not comfort. Hours in the saddle day after day would lead to excruciating saddle sores, chafing and aching muscles you never knew you had. Imagine the burning friction, the constant pressure points, the sheer physical discomfort that would become your norm. Beyond the discomfort, there was the constant danger of being thrown. A spooked horse, a misstep, a sudden obstacle. Any of these could send you tumbling, potentially suffering broken bones, or a concussion miles from any help. A simple fall could quickly become a death sentence in the unforgiving wilderness. But if riding a horse was challenging, traveling by wagon was in many ways an even more brutal experience. Forget the comfortable suspension of modern vehicles. A pioneer wagon had no suspension system beyond its wooden frame and the slight give of its iron tires. Every rock, every rut, every unexpected hole in the crude dirt tracks was felt directly and jarringly by every bone in your body. This constant jarring motion often caused a debilitating condition known as wagon sickness, strikingly similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous, dizzy, and utterly miserable for days on end. The roads themselves were not roads at all in the modern sense. They were mere dirt tracks carved out by previous travelers that turned into knee-deep, sucking quagmires of mud with even a moderate rain. When dry, these same tracks became thick dust bowls, the fine particles kicked up by animals and wheels coating everything in a suffocating, gritty layer, making breathing difficult and obscuring visibility. And inevitably, wagons frequently broke down. A cracked wheel, a snapped axle, a splintered spoke. These mechanical failures could leave you stranded miles from any settlement with only your wits and whatever tools you possessed to effect a repair, often under a blazing sun or in freezing rain. The perilous 2,000-mile undertaking that was the Oregon Trail, predominantly traversed between the 1840s and 1860s, serves as a stark, chilling testament to the dangers of frontier travel. Of the approximately 400,000 individuals who attempted this arduous journey, an estimated 1 in 10, a staggering 40,000 people, never survived to reach their destination. It earned the grim moniker, the nation's longest graveyard, with estimates suggesting that between 10 and 15 people died for every mile of the trail. That means a grave marked or unmarked roughly every 350 feet along the entire route. The trail was literally lined with makeshift crosses, crude stone markers, or simply small mounds of earth, many of them unnamed, as families were forced by the relentless demands of the journey to bury their loved ones quickly and continue onward, their grief compacted into hurried rites and silent tears. There was simply no time for extended mourning. Stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind could mean starvation, freezing, or worse. Of all the myriad dangers lurking on the Oregon Trail, and indeed throughout the frontier, one stands as the undisputed #1 killer disease. Far more insidious than any bandit or wild animal, unseen enemies swept through wagon trains with horrifying efficiency. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. It caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, rapidly dehydrating its victims, often leading to death within a matter of hours. There was no effective treatment, no cure. Once it took hold, it could sweep through an entire camp, turning a vibrant group of pioneers into a collection of desperately ill, dying individuals in a terrifyingly short span of time. Wagon trains sometimes lost dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak, the journey suddenly transforming from a hopeful trek into a mass funeral procession. But cholera was not alone in its deadly work. Dysentery, typhoid, and what was vaguely termed mountain fever also claimed countless lives, each a variation on the theme of gastrointestinal distress and systemic infection. Children with their less developed immune systems were especially vulnerable. It was not uncommon for families to lose multiple children on the journey, their dreams of a new life shattered by the cold reality of contagion. The rudimentary medical care available on the trail, often consisting of ineffective folk remedies and superstitious practices, offered little to no defense against these microscopic scourges. The best hope was simply to outrun the disease, to keep moving to find fresh water that hadn't been contaminated by a previous wagon train. Beyond the invisible killers, the trail presented very tangible, often terrifying physical obstacles, none more treacherous than deadly river crossings. Wagons, those heavy, cumbersome vehicles, were not designed to float. Yet pioneers had to cross numerous rivers, some wide and fast-flowing, others surprisingly deep. The common method was to ferry the wagons across by sealing the beds with tar and floating them like makeshift boats, often with livestock swimming alongside. This was a precarious undertaking. Wagons frequently capsized, spilling their precious contents, and tragically their human cargo into the swirling currents. People and livestock drowned, swept away by the unforgiving water, and irreplaceable supplies were lost forever. The Platte, the Columbia, and the Snake Rivers, to name just a few, claimed hundreds of lives, their waters becoming silent liquid graves. Each river crossing was a moment of profound dread, a gamble with destiny. And then there's the often misrepresented reality of violence on the trail. Contrary to the popular belief perpetuated by countless films and dime novels, attacks by Native Americans were in the grand scheme of things relatively rare. In fact, many Native American tribes were surprisingly helpful, offering much-needed supplies, invaluable guidance through treacherous terrain, and assistance in navigating unfamiliar landscapes. The vast majority of violent deaths that occurred on the trail came not from armed conflict, but from accidents. Being crushed by heavy wagon wheels, which could easily weigh over 1,000 pounds, was a tragically common occurrence. Drowning, as we've discussed, claimed many lives. And being kicked or trampled by the powerful draft animals pulling the wagons, such as oxen or mules, was another frequent cause of fatal injury. Perhaps most shockingly, firearms accidents were distressingly common. Most travelers, having never handled a weapon beyond perhaps a hunting rifle or a musket back home, were inexperienced with the firearms they carried for protection or for hunting game. Accidental discharges, mishandling of loaded weapons, or simply a lack of understanding about weapon safety led to countless unintended deaths and severe injuries among the pioneers themselves. The romantic image of the skilled marksman or the quick-draw hero simply didn't align with the often clumsy and dangerous reality of an armed populace. The immense psychological toll of the journey cannot be overstated. Imagine the relentless stress, the constant physical hardship, the gnawing anxiety of the unknown, all compounded by profound grief. Families were forced to bury their children. Their parents, their spouses often in shallow, unmarked graves along the trail with no time for extended mourning. They had to continue immediately, the demands of the journey overriding the natural human need for grieving. This sustained pressure. This endless series of challenges led many travelers to the brink of mental breakdown. Suicide was not uncommon among trail migrants, a tragic escape from an unbearable reality. And even upon survival, even upon reaching their hoped-for destination, the new arrivals often found themselves destitute, malnourished, ill, and facing yet another set of harsh realities in their chosen new home. The journey itself was just the first, albeit monumental, hurdle. Even short journeys in the Wild West were fraught with peril. The threat of outlaws, though exaggerated in myth, was a legitimate concern. Lone riders or small groups were easy targets for opportunistic bandits. While the frequency of stagecoach robberies is often overblown in fiction, they were a real enough danger to warrant constant vigilance. But more omnipresent were the threats posed by the natural environment itself. Flash floods could appear without warning, turning dry washes into raging torrents. The lethal desert heat caused dehydration and heat strokes, silently claiming lives. Winter blizzards brought freezing deaths and desperate, unimaginable situations such as the infamous Donner Party, where survival demanded unthinkable sacrifices. Navigation before detailed maps and GPS was a monumental challenge. Travelers relied on vague directions, changeable landmarks, or unreliable guides. Getting lost in the vast, undifferentiated landscape was not an inconvenience. It was more often than not a death sentence. Having explored the individual struggles for survival and the perilous nature of frontier travel, we now shift our focus to the broader canvas of the Wild West. This was not a monolithic landscape populated solely by figures from a single archetype. It was a complex, vibrant, and often volatile tapestry woven from diverse peoples, evolving social structures, and stark economic realities that shaped distinct and often contrasting experiences. It was a meeting ground of global cultures converging on a relatively unmapped and untamed land. When you think of the Wild West, you might immediately picture the rugged white cowboy or the stoic, determined settler. But this mental image, while iconic, is woefully incomplete. The American West was a melting pot, and not always a harmonious one. Consider the Chinese immigrants, for instance, who played an absolutely critical yet often unacknowledged role in shaping the landscape. They were the backbone of railroad construction, performing some of the most dangerous and backbreaking work, laying tracks through mountains and across vast plains. They also toiled as miners, seeking their fortunes in the gold and silver rushes, and established themselves as shrewd merchants in burgeoning towns. Their presence brought new customs, languages, and culinary traditions to the frontier, enriching the cultural fabric even as they faced immense prejudice. Then there were the Mexican families who had for centuries called the vast expanse of the Southwest their home long before it was ever considered U.S. territory. Their cultural heritage, their language, their agricultural practices, and their unique legal systems, particularly regarding water rights in arid environments, were deeply embedded in the land. When the lines on the map shifted after the Mexican-American War, these long-established communities found themselves living under a new flag, facing new laws, and often losing their ancestral lands. And the cowboys themselves, the very symbol of the West. They were far more diverse than often depicted. Black cowboys, for example, made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. Seeking opportunity and a measure of freedom from the systemic oppression of the post-Civil War South, they brought their skills and resilience to the cattle trails, contributing immensely to the booming ranching industry. their stories often overlooked are a testament to their strength and adaptability in a landscape that promised both hardship and possibility. Beyond these European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia flocked westward, each group bringing their unique customs, languages, and dreams, adding further layers to the frontier's complex social mosaic. They settled in farming communities, worked in mines, and established businesses forever changing the demographic landscape. But central to the narrative, and often tragically so, were the Native American nations. Dozens of distinct nations with their own intricate cultures, languages, spiritual beliefs, and sophisticated social structures had called these lands home for millennia. They possessed deep generational knowledge of the land, its resources, and its rhythms. The expansion of white settlement was for these indigenous peoples a catastrophic wave that swept across their ancestral territories. The impact was immediate and devastating. The indigenous population estimated to be around 15 million across North and South America before European contact was reduced to fewer than 300,000 by 1900 in the United States alone. This cataclysmic decline was due to a horrifying confluence of factors: the introduction of European diseases against which native peoples had no immunity, direct warfare forced relocation onto often desolate reservations, and critically the deliberate and systematic destruction of their primary food sources, most notably the American bison. The diversity of the frontier, however, did not translate into equality or harmony. Far from it. Racial violence was not an aberration, but a common, often systemic feature of life. Chinese railroad workers vital to the nation's expansion faced brutal discrimination, forced into the most dangerous jobs, like blasting tunnels through mountainsides for lower pay than their white counterparts. This anti-Chinese sentiment culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major U.S. law restricting immigration based explicitly on nationality, a stark legal embodiment of frontier prejudice. Chinese miners too frequently found themselves driven from productive claims through violence or unjust foreign miners' taxes, effectively designed to keep them out of the competition. The shifting geopolitical landscape after the Mexican-American War saw Mexican landowners whose families had cultivated the land for generations frequently witness their property seized. This often happened through manipulative legal means, where American common law, particularly regarding land ownership and water rights, replaced the Spanish-derived systems that were ironically far more effective for managing arid environments. Or in some cases, property was simply taken through outright theft, with little recourse for the displaced. Black Americans, as mentioned, moved west, seeking a measure of freedom from the brutal oppression of the South, only to often encounter entrenched, if subtly different, forms of frontier racism. Despite their crucial contributions to ranching and other industries, they were frequently excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance, finding that the promise of the West was often selectively delivered. But no group faced a more profound and existential threat than the Native American nations. The relentless expansion of white settlement was for them a catastrophic apocalyptic event. The indigenous population, which had thrived on these lands for millennia, was decimated. Beyond disease and direct warfare, the systematic destruction of their primary food sources, particularly the vast buffalo herds, served a chilling purpose. This wasn't merely about hunting. It was a deliberate U.S. government policy, a military strategy designed to deprive Plains Indian tribes of their very means of survival, forcing them onto reservations, often on land deemed undesirable by settlers. It was a cold, calculated campaign of cultural eradication aimed at breaking indigenous resistance by eliminating their traditional way of life. The U.S. government policies systematically pushed Native Americans onto reservations, consistently breaking treaties, often within a few years of their signing, and showing little regard for the sovereign rights of indigenous nations. A particularly tragic and enduring scar on this history was the forced removal of Native children from their families sent to boarding schools explicitly designed for cultural erasure. The horrifying motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," encapsulates the brutal assimilationist agenda, stripping children of their language, their spiritual beliefs, and their cultural identity. The romanticized cowboys versus Indians narratives, so prevalent in popular culture, grotesquely misrepresented the complex interactions between these groups. The violence that did occur was often the culmination of repeated treaty violations, relentless encroachment on ancestral lands, and calculated provocations by settlers and the military. It was rarely the simple good versus evil confrontation depicted in dime novels. Furthermore, there were fundamental misunderstandings that doomed many treaty negotiations from the start. Many Native American groups, particularly those reliant on nomadic or semi-nomadic ways of life, simply could not conceive of owning land in the European sense of drawing lines on a map and fencing off territory. The land was a shared resource, a spiritual provider, not a commodity to be bought and sold. This profound philosophical difference often rendered negotiations meaningless, leading to inevitable conflict and tragic outcomes. Let us now turn our attention to the unsung heroes and the often overlooked struggles of women on the frontier. Far from the delicate, protected figures often depicted in early westerns, frontier women performed incredibly demanding physical labor both within and outside the home. Their days began before dawn and often ended well after dark with precious few rest days. On homesteads and farms, they handled the traditional domestic duties, cooking over an open fire, meticulous cleaning in a perpetually dusty environment, raising children and making clothing from raw materials. But their responsibilities extended far beyond the domestic sphere. They worked alongside their husbands in the fields, tending crops, milking cows, and often defending their homes from predators or human threats. Imagine for a moment the sheer breadth of their daily tasks. A frontier woman might spend her morning plowing fields, then rush inside to deliver a neighbor's baby, returning home to fight off a pack of hungry coyotes from the chicken coop, all while managing her own household and caring for her children. Many became young widows, their husbands lost to accident, disease, or violence, forcing them to manage farms or businesses alone, often with multiple children to raise. Their resilience and sheer physical fortitude were truly astonishing, a testament to the brutal demands placed upon them. Despite these absolutely essential contributions, women in most territories and states of the Wild West had surprisingly few legal rights. Generally, they couldn't vote, a right still decades away for the rest of the nation. If married, they typically couldn't own property independently, their legal identity subsumed by their husbands. In the event of a divorce, which was rare and socially stigmatized, custody of children almost universally went to the father regardless of the circumstances. Domestic violence was largely considered a private family matter with little to no legal recourse for the victim. Professional opportunities beyond the domestic sphere were severely limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions open to women, but it often came with significantly lower pay than men received for similar work, and teachers were frequently expected to resign upon marriage, as if their marital status suddenly rendered them incapable of instruction. Despite these pervasive limitations, some frontier women found avenues for economic independence, carving out niches in a world that offered few official pathways for female autonomy. Running boarding houses where they cooked, Cleaned and managed accommodation for transient workers and travelers was one such common occupation. Nursing, though rudimentary and often without formal training, offered another path for those with a knack for healing and care. Millinery and dressmaking, providing essential clothing services, allowed some women to establish their own businesses and support themselves. However, for many women facing dire economic desperation, particularly in the rougher boom towns, the only viable option was to enter the world of prostitution, often referred to euphemistically as soiled doves. These women faced extreme physical abuse, rampant drug addiction, and the constant threat of venereal disease, which was untreatable and devastating. Socially ostracized, they existed on the fringes of society, and even if they somehow managed to accumulate some wealth, it was incredibly difficult for them to transition back into respectable society, their past forever marking them. Yet amidst these widespread restrictions, the Wild West ironically offered pockets of surprising progressive freedom for women that predated broader national movements. The sheer shortage of women in many Western territories, particularly in the initial phases of settlement, sometimes gave them more marriage options, and perhaps more significantly, a degree of better treatment and respect than their Eastern counterparts might have experienced. More strikingly, a few territories, notably Wyoming and Utah, granted women the right to vote decades before the 19th Amendment finally enshrined that right across the entire United States. This recognition of women's suffrage was often a pragmatic acknowledgement of their absolutely crucial contributions to the survival and development of these frontier communities, a silent testament to their undeniable strength and resilience. Now, let us turn to the challenging and often chaotic reality of law and order in a land that often seemed to defy it. The system of justice on the frontier was far from uniform, complex, and varied dramatically by location. In the vast, sprawling rural areas, official protection was minimal, almost non-existent. County sheriffs, typically elected officials, were responsible for enormous territories, sometimes encompassing thousands of square miles. Regular patrols were quite simply impossible. These sheriffs relied heavily on deputizing ordinary citizens, forming temporary posses to pursue criminals, a system that was often inefficient and prone to abuse. Within town limits, the town marshal was the primary law enforcement presence. This was a dangerous and often poorly paid job, attracting a mix of truly dedicated public servants and those who perhaps enjoyed the power and notoriety the badge conferred, as evidenced by the often fluid and morally ambiguous careers of figures like Wyatt Earp, who moved between lawman gambler and even brothel keeper. Federal marshals, the highest tier of law enforcement, were few in number and focused primarily on major crimes like bank robbery or murder that crossed territorial lines. The legendary image of the single-handed federal marshal riding into town to clean it up was, for the most part, a fictional embellishment. In many remote areas where formal law enforcement was either entirely absent or simply ineffective, justice was often handled through informal community action. Vigilante groups formed ostensibly to maintain order and dispense justice. While some of these groups did indeed serve to quell rampant lawlessness in a chaotic environment, they could just as easily become vehicles for prejudice, personal vendettas, or brutal mob violence. Lynch mobs, for instance, were a common and horrifying reality where innocent until proven guilty rarely applied. Someone accused of horse theft or cattle rustling crimes deemed particularly egregious on the frontier might find themselves facing a hanging before sunset with no trial, no judge, and no jury. This was frontier justice, swift, often brutal, and deeply arbitrary. The reality of violence itself was also a far cry from the stylized Hollywood myth. The quick-draw duels in the dusty streets at high noon, so iconic in Western films, were exceedingly rare, almost entirely a Hollywood invention. Most frontier violence was sudden, chaotic, and utterly devoid of honor. Ambush was common, as were acts of violence committed during robberies or in the heat of a drunken dispute. More common forms of violence were mundane, impulsive, and often fueled by raw alcohol barroom brawls that escalated quickly, domestic disputes that remained hidden but were no less brutal, and arguments over land boundaries or straying livestock. Criminal punishment was harsh and immediate. Hanging was the standard sentence for murder, rape, and often serious theft. Prisons were primitive, often overcrowded, unsanitary, and riddled with disease leading to tragically high mortality rates. Communities often preferred the immediate definitive action of execution to the long-term, expensive, and often ineffective process of imprisonment. Now let us delve into the brutal allure of frontier occupations, the ways in which people desperately tried to carve out a living in this unforgiving landscape. The myths surrounding professions like mining, ranching, and farming often gloss over the sheer back-breaking labor and constant peril involved. Consider mining the brutal quest for fortune. The mythology paints a vivid picture of lucky prospectors striking it rich with a pickaxe and a pan, stumbling upon veins of gold or silver that would guarantee a life of luxury. The reality of the 1870s, however, was a far more brutal and often heartbreaking tale. Simply staking a claim was difficult, requiring substantial fees and navigating a labyrinth of legalities that often favored the well-connected. For the common man, the dream of easy wealth quickly dissolved into a harsh struggle for subsistence. Placer mining. The image of a lone prospector panning for gold in a stream was incredibly demanding. It involved hours bent over in ice-cold water, patiently sifting through sediment, your hands cracked and raw from the cold, and friction, your back aching with a dull, persistent throb. Often, after a full day of such grueling effort, you would yield only a few pennies worth of gold dust, barely enough to cover your meager expenses for the day. It was a constant, tiring grind far removed from the sudden, exhilarating discovery. Hard rock mining, which involved digging deep into the earth to extract ore from veins, multiplied these dangers exponentially. The constant threat of cave-ins was ever present, a terrifying rumbling that could at any moment seal your fate beneath tons of earth and rock. Toxic gases, like carbon monoxide, often seeped into the shafts, silently stealing the air from your lungs and leading to unconsciousness or death. Premature explosions from blasting powder used to break up rock were horrifyingly common, leaving miners maimed or killed. Miners suffered long-term health issues directly attributable to their work. Silicosis, often called black lung, a debilitating lung disease caused by inhaling dust, slowly suffocated them. Mercury poisoning used in the amalgamation process to extract gold caused neurological damage, tremors, and madness. Lead absorption from the ore itself further compounded their suffering. There were virtually no safety regulations in place. Owners prioritized profit above all else, seeing human lives as expendable. An injury, even a minor one, often meant the immediate end of a miner's career with no disability support, no safety net, and certainly no workers' compensation to cushion the fall. The vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages, often just $2 to $3 for a 10 to 12-hour day of dangerous work. Ironically, the storekeepers, the saloon owners, and the prostitutes in these mining towns often made far more money feeding off the desperate hopes and meager earnings of the miners themselves. Mining towns were notoriously rough, transient places, primarily populated by young single men. Alcohol consumption was astronomical, violence rampant, and sanitation abysmal, making them breeding grounds for typhoid, cholera, and dysentery. The concept of banking was primitive. Often there were no banks at all, forcing miners to rely on saloons or general stores to buy their gold at low rates, further eroding their already small earnings. Bank failures were common, and widespread counterfeit currency added another layer of economic insecurity to an already precarious existence. Then there was ranching, the iconic cowboy life, which also carried its own unique set of perils. Starting a ranch required significant capital for land, livestock, equipment, and buildings, often leading to deep, unforgiving debt from the outset. But even with the initial investment, nature itself was an unpredictable and brutal adversary. Droughts could starve entire herds, turning vast pastures into dusty, barren plains. Harsh winters like the devastating Great Die-Up of 1886-87 could kill up to 90% of a rancher's herd, wiping out years of hard work and investment in a single freezing season. Disease like Texas fever or anthrax could sweep through cattle, and with no effective treatments, could wipe out entire herds just as quickly as a blizzard. Predators like wolves and cougars, poisonous plants, and unforeseen dangers like quicksand further reduced the numbers of valuable livestock. Every year was a gamble against the elements and the unseen scourges. The cowboy's life, far from the glorified adventures seen on screen, was one of unrelenting hardship. Typically, a cowboy would earn around $30 a month for this exhausting, dangerous work, living on minimal fresh food, usually just beans, salt pork, and coffee, and sleeping rough under the open sky regardless of the weather. Injuries were common and often went untreated, leading to chronic pain and lifelong disabilities. A broken arm or leg, which might be a temporary inconvenience today, could mean the end of a cowboy's ability to work, condemning him to a life of destitution. Their resilience was born of necessity, their silent endurance, a testament to a life where comfort was a fleeting thought and survival the only constant. And then there was farming, perhaps the most widespread and fundamentally difficult occupation on the frontier. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered the alluring promise of 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to settle and improve it for 5 years. But the reality was far more challenging than the legislative promise. While 160 acres might have been sufficient in the fertile East, it was often woefully insufficient in the arid regions of the West, where traditional Eastern farming methods failed miserably without knowledge of dry farming techniques, which were slow to be adopted. The initial investment in tools, seed, and animals, even for free land, was often prohibitive, pushing many into immediate crushing debt. The sheer physical labor required to turn raw prairie into productive farmland was immense. Building a sod house, the iconic dwelling of the plains, involved cutting and stacking heavy blocks of sod, creating a structure that was dark, damp, often leaked during rain, and harbored all manner of pests, from insects to snakes. But the true agony lay in breaking the prairie sod itself. The dense, interwoven roots of the prairie grasses formed a thick, almost impenetrable mat that resisted even the strongest plows. It could take a year or more of back-breaking labor to prepare even a few acres for planting, and this brutal, repetitive work permanently damaged farmers' bodies, leaving them with chronic back pain, joint issues, and strained muscles. The threats to their crops were legion and often biblical in their scale. Droughts could wither an entire year's harvest, leading to starvation. Torrential rains could wash away freshly planted seeds or rot mature crops in the field. An early frost could descend without warning, ruining everything just before harvest. And then there were the grasshoppers. Imagine swarms so vast and dense They would darken the sky, descending upon fields and devouring every living green thing, leaving behind only barren earth. They would eat the crops, the leaves off the trees, even the wooden handles of tools. A family's entire livelihood, a year of relentless toil, could vanish in a single afternoon. The human element was just as fragile. If a family member fell ill during critical periods like planting or harvest, it could mean the difference between survival and starvation, as there was little to no hired help available in remote areas. Women, even while pregnant or shortly after childbirth, were expected to perform their full share of the farm labor, often with devastating consequences for their health. Farm accidents like those in other frontier occupations were common and often fatal. Homemade tools, breaking panicked animals, trampling workers, suffocation in grain bins, or collapsing storage buildings. The psychological toll of this constant struggle, the profound isolation, especially for women who could go months without adult conversation outside their immediate family, was immense. This too contributed to cases of prairie madness, a quiet, desperate unraveling of the mind amidst the vast emptiness. Economically independent farmers faced tremendous obstacles. Transportation to markets was often difficult and expensive, with rudimentary roads and long distances. Large corporations, particularly the powerful railroad companies, held immense sway, keeping crop prices low for farmers, while simultaneously charging high, often extortionate transport costs. This created a squeeze, making it incredibly difficult for independent farmers to make a profit, often trapping them in a cycle of debt and hardship. Finally, as towns grew and industries developed, wage labor emerged as an alternative to independent ventures, but it introduced its own new forms of hardship. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Horrific injuries from unguarded machinery were common, as were fatal falls in construction. Railroad work in particular was notoriously dangerous. Track layers faced exhaustion and heat stroke, and Chinese workers, as mentioned, were disproportionately assigned the most perilous blasting tasks. Workers toiled for long hours, typically 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days a week, for low subsistence wages that barely covered their living expenses. Child labor was distressingly common, with children as young as 8 or 9 working dangerous jobs and suffering higher injury rates than adults. There were no legal protections for workers. Employers could fire without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay. Complaining often resulted in blacklisting, making it impossible to find work elsewhere. In company towns, where a single employer owned all housing and businesses, prices were often inflated, and workers were paid in script currency, valid only at company stores, creating a system of debt bondage that was nearly impossible to escape. As the 1870s wore on, the raw, untamed essence of the Wild West began to transform slowly but inexorably from a frontier of individual struggle and isolated communities into an increasingly integrated corporatized economy. This was the beginning of the end for the wild, as it had been known, and the rise of a new powerful corporate influence. The initial phase of individual prospectors, lone cowboys and homesteading farmers driven by personal dreams of fortune and independence, gradually gave way to organized corporate development. The most significant catalyst for this profound shift was the arrival of the railroads. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, followed by a vast network of feeder lines, dramatically integrated the West into the burgeoning national economy. These iron arteries connected isolated regions, once weeks or months away from civilization, to national markets and supply chains, effectively shrinking the vast distances and bridging the chasm between East and West. This new infrastructure enabled large-scale extraction of the West's immense natural resources, minerals, timber, agricultural products, which could now be efficiently transported to the hungry factories and growing cities of the East. Conversely, mass-produced goods from Eastern industries began to flood Western markets, bringing with them a veneer of modern convenience but also fundamentally altering local economies. Small independent producers in the West, whether individual miners, farmers, or loggers, simply could not compete with the industrial methods, vast capital and distribution networks of these newly arrived powerful corporations. They were often squeezed out, bought out, or forced into wage labor for the very entities that had displaced them. The promise of individual enterprise was increasingly overshadowed by the reality of corporate dominance. With the railroads came stability, and with stability came what some might call domestication. The rough-edged mining camps and transient cattle towns, once hotbeds of lawlessness and ephemeral dreams, began to acquire the institutions of more established society. Banks appeared offering financial services and a degree of stability that had been lacking. Schools were built, bringing a more formalized approach to education, signaling a commitment to a settled future. Churches rose, providing spiritual guidance and crucially serving as vital social hubs. Newspapers began to circulate more regularly, offering local news and connecting communities. Theaters and other forms of entertainment also emerged, reflecting a desire for cultural refinement beyond the raw survivalist ethos. Streets that had once been impassable mud pits began to be paved, and hastily constructed wooden shanties were slowly replaced by more permanent, often brick structures. Local governments began to enact regulations establishing order where chaos once reigned. For some, particularly those who cherished the absolute freedom and raw independence of the untamed wilderness, these changes were profoundly unwelcome. They viewed it as a domestication of wild spaces, a loss of the very essence that had drawn them west. For these individuals, the response was often to simply move further west, chasing the ever-receding frontier, forever seeking that wild, untamed edge. And along with this domestication came the gradual taming of violence. The iconic gunfighters and notorious outlaws whose legends would grow disproportionately large in the public imagination operated within a specific historical window, a brief chaotic period when formal law enforcement was just beginning to establish itself. Figures like Billy the Kid, Jesse James, or the Dalton Gang, though certainly real, found their fame in the liminal space between true lawlessness and burgeoning order. By the 1880s and 1890s, as towns matured and became more settled, professional police forces and organized court systems gradually replaced the often arbitrary and brutal vigilante justice that had once been the norm in most established communities. The mythologization of these figures, perpetuated by sensational dime novels and later Hollywood, often obscured the complex and frequently morally ambiguous reality of their lives. For example, Wild Bill Hickok, often portrayed as a heroic lawman, was also known to be a gambler who shot bystanders and had a penchant for violence outside the bounds of his official duties. Wyatt Earp, as previously noted, famously moved between being a lawman, a gambler, and a brothel keeper, his career a testament to the fluid morality of the era. The lines between good and bad, hero and villain, were rarely as clear-cut as the stories suggested. The gradual imposition of formalized law and order, however imperfect, fundamentally reshaped the landscape of violence in the West, pushing it from the open street into the shadows, making it less a feature of daily life and more a criminal act to be suppressed. Having navigated the tangible hardships of daily survival, the perils of journeys, and the intricate, often brutal social dynamics that defined the American West, we now turn our attention to something less immediately visible, yet profoundly influential. The cultural perceptions, the unique relationship with the vast, untamed land, and the enduring myths that were forged in this crucible of experience continuing to shape our understanding even today. Beyond the grit and the guns, the Wild West possessed a distinctive cultural fabric woven from necessity, isolation, and a unique rhythm of life. One of the most striking differences between your modern life and existence on the frontier was the remarkably fluid relationship with time. Forget the carefully measured minutes and hours of your digital age, the precise scheduling of appointments, or the frantic rush to meet deadlines. On the frontier, time was a far more organic reality, governed not by clocks, but by the relentless dictates of daylight, the changing seasons, and the natural rhythms of the land. Most people woke at dawn, or even before it, with the first glimmer of light on the horizon, and they worked until sunset, or well after it, by the flickering light of a lamp. Active hours expanded and contracted with the seasons longer in the relentless heat of summer, shorter and more constrained during the freezing grip of winter. Work was not measured by an 8-hour shift or a 40-hour week. It was measured by tasks, the fields that needed to be plowed, the cattle that needed to be moved, the crops that needed to be harvested before an unexpected frost. There were long, unbroken stretches of labor during crucial periods where the concept of a break was almost entirely alien. Punctuality, as we understand it, had very limited relevance. Morning, or after dinner, or when the sun is high, were often sufficient time designations. The sun was your clock, the seasons your calendar, and the demands of survival your schedule. This wasn't a leisurely pace. It was a deeply ingrained natural rhythm of life, punctuated by periods of intense, demanding labor that would leave your modern sensibilities reeling. After such exhausting workdays, with bodies aching and minds weary, there was little energy for complex or elaborate activities. Simple entertainment and precious leisure time became profound luxuries. Common evening pastimes were often deeply communal conversation around a flickering fire, the sharing of stories that served as both entertainment and education, or simple card games played with worn decks by the dim light of an oil lamp. Music, when available, was a treasured commodity. The haunting notes of a fiddle, the plaintive melody of a harmonica, or the strumming of a worn guitar often provided the soundtrack to social dances and community gatherings, bringing a rare moment of lightness and joy to lives otherwise dominated by hardship. Reading material was incredibly precious and often shared amongst families and neighbors. A single book might be read aloud slowly, carefully over many evenings, its contents absorbed and discussed before being passed along to the next eager reader. Newspapers, when they arrived weeks or months after publication, were scrutinized for every scrap of information, devoured for glimpses of the wider world, however outdated. Organized sports as we know them were simpler, less formalized affairs, often just impromptu games of baseball with makeshift equipment, horse racing on open ground, wrestling matches, or shooting competitions that honed practical skills as much as they provided entertainment. Children, too, found ways to play with minimal equipment, inventing games of tag, hide and seek, or stickball with whatever was at hand. These were not the organized, structured activities of today, but spontaneous, often physically demanding expressions of youthful energy. Holidays and community celebrations, though rare, were profoundly important. The 4th of July harvest festivals, or perhaps a rare barn raising, became crucial opportunities for socializing, for breaking the isolating monotony of frontier life. These were moments when dispersed families could reunite, when news could be shared face to face, and when the collective spirit of the community could be rekindled through shared food, music, and laughter. These were not simply days off. They were vital social anchors, providing a release valve for the pressures of daily existence and strengthening the bonds that were so essential for collective survival. Central to the cultural fabric of frontier life beyond the fleeting moments of leisure was the crucial role of community institutions and the deep-seated tradition of mutual aid. In a landscape where formal structures were scarce, the church often played a vital role that extended far beyond its spiritual function. It served as a primary social hub, a central gathering place where families could meet, exchange news, and find solace in shared faith. It was often the first educational center providing rudimentary schooling before dedicated schoolhouses were built. And crucially, it acted as a mutual aid society, organizing support for those in need, whether it was a family struck by illness, a farmer who lost his crops, or a widow struggling to survive. Religious leaders, often the most educated individuals in a given area, frequently took on additional roles as teachers, dispute mediators, and community organizers, their influence extending into every facet of frontier life. The very establishment of community institutions, schools, churches, meeting halls marked a profound shift, signaling a commitment to permanent settlement and a collective belief in the future of the new home. Alongside individual ruggedness, a powerful tradition of cooperative effort was absolutely necessary for survival. Think of a barn raising, a quintessential frontier activity where an entire community would come together to construct a barn for a neighbor. This wasn't a casual offer of help. It was an expected, vital communal effort, allowing for large, otherwise impossible projects to be completed in a single day. Harvest teams formed to ensure that crops were gathered before an early frost or a sudden storm could destroy them, a shared labor that benefited everyone. Spontaneous search parties would form to find lost children or stray cattle, driven by an unspoken understanding that one day you might need the same help. This community interdependence existed powerfully alongside the celebrated frontier individualism, both essential responses to the harsh and unpredictable conditions of the West. It was a delicate balance, the self-reliant spirit that pushed people westward, tempered by the absolute necessity of relying on your neighbors when faced with overwhelming challenges. This relationship with the land, however, was fundamentally different from modern environmental perspectives. The prevailing frontier mentality viewed nature primarily as a resource to be conquered, exploited, and tamed, rather than something to be preserved or lived in harmony with. This was a reflection of the era's dominant ideology of manifest destiny, the belief in America's divinely ordained right to expand westward, coupled with the immense struggle for survival. Timber was cut without any thought for regeneration, vast forests cleared for farmland or building materials. Game was hunted to near extinction, not just for food, but often for hides or sport, without any concept of sustainable management. Rivers and streams were diverted and polluted for mining operations, their natural flows altered, and their waters contaminated without regard for downstream consequences or ecological impact. The idea of conservation was simply not part of the common lexicon or practice. The land was there to be used, and its resources, seemingly endless, were there for the taking. The near extinction of the American bison stands as a stark and tragic example of this exploitative approach and indeed of environmental warfare. From an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roaming the Great Plains in the 1700s, fewer than 1,000 remained by 1884. This catastrophic decline was not solely driven by a need for food or hides, though these were factors. It was also, chillingly, a deliberate U.S. government policy aimed at depriving the Plains Indian tribes of their primary resource, their spiritual and physical lifeblood, thereby forcing them onto reservations and breaking their will to resist. The bison was central to the nomadic, self-sufficient way of life of many Native American nations, providing food, clothing, shelter, and tools. Eliminating the bison was a military strategy, a way to dismantle indigenous resistance by destroying their very means of existence. It reflected a mindset that viewed the land's resources as tools in a broader geopolitical conflict, rather than as integral parts of a complex ecosystem. This systematic destruction of the bison encapsulates a broader cultural phenomenon, the genesis of the Wild West myths, and how they both reflected and distorted the reality of the frontier. The most intense period of myth-making surrounding the Wild West didn't occur during its raw, untamed height, but rather as the actual frontier was rapidly disappearing. This was the era of figures like Buffalo Bill Cody, whose famous Wild West shows, beginning in the 1880s, brought staged reenactments of cowboy and Indian battles, sharpshooting displays, and simulated buffalo hunts to fascinated audiences in the East and Europe. These shows, while entertaining, were not accurate historical depictions. They were carefully curated spectacles designed to resonate with existing romanticized ideas about the West, shaping public perception far more than any dry historical account. Alongside these grand spectacles, dime novels emerged as a powerful force in shaping the frontier narrative. These inexpensive mass-produced paperbacks originated in Eastern publishing houses, written by authors who often had little, if any, first-hand experience of the West. Their stories were formulaic, designed for maximum escapism and easy consumption, emphasizing action-adventure and clear moral distinctions between heroes and villains. They portrayed the West as a grand testing ground for quintessential American virtues: self-reliance, rugged individualism, courage in the face of danger, and the triumph of good over evil. The lone cowboy, the heroic sheriff, the savage Indian, these archetypes were born and solidified in the pages of these sensationalized tales. Later, the burgeoning Hollywood westerns further refined and amplified these mythological elements, creating a powerful, enduring narrative that, while captivating, bore little resemblance to the complex, often messy, historical reality. These myths served powerful psychological and cultural functions for a rapidly changing nation. They offered reassuring narratives about American identity during periods of immense social upheaval, industrialization, and nascent international challenges. At a time when traditional ways of life were being swept away by progress, the frontier myth suggested that the fundamental American character was forged in the crucible of these wild conditions, producing exceptional qualities of resilience, ingenuity, and moral fortitude. The stories implied that American expansion was not just a historical event, but an inevitable and morally justified process, a triumphant march of civilization over wilderness and progress over primitive cultures. They presented simplified moral frameworks where good inevitably triumphed through righteous violence, subtly justifying America's growing power and its often brutal methods of expansion. It was a comforting story, easy to understand, with clear heroes and villains, and a predictable, satisfying ending. However, what these pervasive myths often obscured was the far more complex, morally ambiguous reality of Western development. They conveniently swept under the rug the horrifying genocide of indigenous peoples, reducing their suffering to mere obstacles in the path of progress. They ignored the brutal exploitation of immigrant labor, the Chinese railroad workers, the Mexican miners, and others who built the West with their sweat and blood, but were denied dignity and rights. The myths overlooked the widespread environmental devastation that accompanied settlement, the destruction of ecosystems, and the unthinking consumption of resources. They failed to acknowledge the corporate manipulation of political systems, the immense power wielded by railroad barons and mining magnates who shaped laws and policies to their own benefit, often at the expense of the common settler. Furthermore, the myths largely ignored the deeply divided communities that struggled with fundamental questions of identity governance and resource allocation. The real West offered no simple moral lessons or clear-cut answers. Instead, it presented a complex case study in how human societies adapt to overwhelming challenges, sometimes with incredible cooperation, ingenuity, and community spirit, but just as often with exploitation, greed, and brutal violence. The narrative of the Wild West then became a carefully constructed fiction, serving a national purpose, rather than reflecting a complete historical truth. It shaped perceptions for generations, creating a romanticized vision that was both deeply appealing and profoundly misleading. The enduring legacy of the Wild West therefore extends far beyond the realm of popular mythology. It continues to cast a long shadow influencing not just our cultural narratives, but also the very structures of modern America. Many of our current property laws, for instance, particularly in Western states, have their roots in the haphazard and often contentious land claims of the frontier era. The frameworks for water rights, particularly crucial in the arid West, were forged in an age of scarcity and fierce competition, and their complexities continue to shape environmental policy and economic development today. Even the federal-state relationships, the balance of power between central government and regional authorities, were profoundly impacted by the challenges of governing vast, often rebellious territories. And our national approach to natural resources, oscillating between exploitation and conservation, finds its historical precedent in the choices and struggles of the frontier era. Moreover, the incredible diversity of Western communities, though often marked by conflict, ultimately contributed to the multicultural reality of modern America. The confluence of indigenous nations, European immigrants, Black Americans, and Mexican communities created a vibrant, if often tumultuous, cultural mixing pot that laid the groundwork for the complex tapestry of identities that define the nation today. And the continuing tensions that we grapple with between individual rights and collective welfare, between local control and national directives, and indeed between the exploitation of resources and their careful conservation, all have deep historical roots in the very questions and struggles that confronted frontier societies. The West in many ways was a laboratory for American identity, and the experiments conducted there continue to inform our national character. However, to truly understand the Wild West, we must consciously incorporate the indigenous perspective, which offers a profoundly different and often heartbreaking narrative. For the countless Native American peoples who had called these lands home for millennia, the frontier era represents not a glorious expansion or a triumphant march of civilization, but a period of profound devastation of ancient life. Ways the systematic destruction of their cultures and the beginning of a long, arduous struggle for cultural survival and sovereignty. This perspective reminds us that triumphalist narratives focusing solely on the achievements of settlers ignore the complex, sophisticated civilizations that existed long before European arrival, and the incalculable knowledge of the land of sustainable practices of spiritual wisdom that was lost forever. An accurate and nuanced understanding of the Wild West then requires us to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. We must acknowledge the immense courage, resilience, and ingenuity of the settlers who braved incredible hardships to build new lives. But we must also confront the devastating impact of their arrival on those who were already there, recognizing the immense suffering, displacement, and cultural destruction that accompanied Western expansion. It's about accepting that history is rarely simple and that progress for some often came at an unbearable cost for others. As we slowly drift from these historical reflections, consider the profound silence of the pre-industrial night. Imagine lying in that sod cabin or under the vast star-strewn sky and truly hearing nothing but the sounds of the wind whispering through the prairie grasses, the distant howl of coyotes, perhaps the faint tinny notes of a piano from a far-off saloon. There was no hum of electricity, no distant traffic, no constant digital notifications. It was a silence so deep it would feel almost oppressive to your modern ears. Yet it was the constant companion of frontier folk forcing an introspection that is rare in our noisy world. Returning to your comfortable present, perhaps nestled in a soft bed with the gentle hum of modern conveniences surrounding you, you might now feel a deeper, almost visceral appreciation for the extraordinary comfort and security of modern life. The simple act of turning on a tap for clean hot water, the warmth radiating from your thermostat, the effortless access to fresh, varied food, the instant communication with loved ones, the astonishing advances in medical care. These are not just conveniences. They are profound luxuries, the culmination of centuries of progress, and a stark contrast to the daily struggle for existence that defined the frontier. Reflect for a moment on the lost art of practical self-sufficiency. Imagine if you had to build your own home, not just assemble a flat-pack kit, but fell the trees, hew the logs, and raise the walls with your own hands, or cut and stack sod with aching muscles. Imagine having to repair every tool, every piece of equipment with limited resources and often no spare parts. Picture the necessity of growing all your own food from planting the seeds to harvesting the crops facing the constant threat of drought pests or early frost. Envision the meticulous process of preserving every scrap of food for the long, lean winter months, knowing that failure meant hunger, perhaps even starvation. This was not a hobby or a choice. It was an absolute necessity, a fundamental skill set required for survival. And while we certainly appreciate the ease of modern life, there is a quiet dignity in that lost self-sufficiency, a testament to human ingenuity born of necessity. The real story of the Wild West, then, is not primarily about the iconic gunfights or the dramatic gold strikes that populate our collective imagination. Those were fleeting, sensational moments often exaggerated and distorted by myth. The true narrative is the grinding daily struggles of ordinary people, men, women, and children of incredibly diverse backgrounds facing truly extraordinary challenges. It is the story of their resilience, their adaptability, their often brutal perseverance against overwhelming odds. It is the quiet heroism of enduring another freezing winter, another failed crop, another lost loved one, and still rising with the sun to face the next day. Their legacy, far from being confined to history books, lives on in myriad ways. It is embedded in the established communities and towns that stand today on former frontier lands, their foundations laid by those early determined settlers. It is etched into the very environmental changes that reshaped the landscape from the taming of rivers to the clearing of forests. It is reflected in the cultural patterns and enduring regional identities that still characterize the American West. And of course, it persists in the powerful myths that grew from their experiences, myths that continue to shape how we view our nation and ourselves, even if those myths often obscure the grittier truths. The echoes of the frontier persist in the independent spirit often associated with Western states, in the ongoing debates about land use and resource management, and in the unique forms of local governance that evolved from the initial chaos. The challenges faced by those frontier communities, adapting to a harsh environment, managing scarce resources, building communities from scratch, and balancing individual freedom with collective needs, remain remarkably relevant today, albeit in different forms. We still grapple with environmental adaptation in the face of climate change, with resource management in an increasingly populated world, and with the delicate act of community building in an era of rapid social change. The greatest legacy of the Wild West, perhaps, is not a set of definitive answers, but a timeless collection of profound questions about human adaptation, about the very formation of communities, and about the complex, often fraught relationship between humanity and nature. It invites us to consider what it truly means to survive, to build, and to find meaning in the face of profound adversity. And as you now consider the vast, silent expanse of the night sky, perhaps you can imagine those same stars, billions of years old, having witnessed every struggle, every triumph, every heartbreak of the frontier. They are the same stars that guided the ancestors, providing a timeless, comforting connection between your present moment and that distant, challenging past. Let us delve deeper into the physical realities of the climate, something we largely insulate ourselves from today. Imagine the brutal simplicity of life in a sod house. These dwellings, common on the treeless plains, were literally built from blocks of prairie turf cut with a special plow. While they offered some insulation against the extreme temperatures, they were perpetually damp, their earthen walls sweating with condensation, especially after a rain. The floors were often just packed earth turning to mud with any spill or prolonged dampness. Insects and rodents were constant, unwelcome residents sharing your living space without invitation. The dim light filtering through a single small window, often made of greased paper rather than glass, created a perpetually twilight atmosphere, reinforcing the sense of isolation and confinement. The air inside would often be thick with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and stale human breath, a constant reminder of your primitive existence. Consider the simple act of staying warm or cool. There was no adjustable thermostat, no central air conditioning unit humming quietly in the background. In the unforgiving plains winters, blizzards could rage for days, trapping families inside their flimsy shelters. Fuel, typically buffalo chips, dried manure, or scarce wood, was a constant, desperate concern. Every piece of fuel burned was one less for tomorrow, a finite resource in a world of infinite cold. The only warmth came from a rough-hewn fireplace, which had to be carefully stoked and constantly fed. At night, as the fire died down to conserve precious fuel, the cabin's interior temperatures plummeted, often dropping well below freezing. You would sleep fully clothed, perhaps, under layers of rough wool blankets or animal hides, your breath misting in the frigid air, the very water in your wash basin frozen solid by morning. Frostbite was not an abstract medical term, but a constant threat to your extremities, capable of rendering you permanently maimed. Conversely, the summers were periods of intense, relentless heat, particularly in the arid regions. With no escape from the sun's scorching rays, homes became ovens, trapping the oppressive heat inside. Windows and doors, if they existed beyond a simple opening covered by a hide, offered little ventilation. You would sweat constantly, your clothes sticking to your skin, providing little relief. Dehydration was a silent killer, and heat stroke could incapacitate or kill a person within hours, especially during strenuous labor under the open sky. The very air you breathed could feel thick and stifling, offering no respite. The absence of refrigeration meant that food spoiled rapidly, compounding the challenge of maintaining a nutritious diet in the sweltering heat. The landscape itself was a character, a powerful, indifferent force. The vast open plains, while offering a sense of boundless freedom, also presented an overwhelming, monotonous expanse, that could induce a profound sense of loneliness. With no familiar landmarks, no distant city lights, the sheer emptiness could be psychologically draining. The Rocky Mountains. While majestic were formidable barriers, their high passes treacherous and often impassable for months due to snow. Deserts often overlooked in the cowboy narrative were brutal, stark environments where water was precious and life itself seemed a defiant act. Flash floods, sudden and violent, could transform dry washes into raging torrents in minutes, sweeping away everything in their path. Blizzards, as mentioned, could trap travelers and settlements under feet of snow, isolating them for weeks. Tornadoes, though less common, could appear without warning on the plains, devastating everything in their path with a terrifying roar. The relationship between humans and their animals was also fundamentally different. Livestock, horses, mules, oxen, cattle were not just economic assets. They were essential partners in survival. They provided power for plowing, transportation, food, and clothing. Their health and well-being were directly tied to your own. A sick or injured animal could spell disaster for a family, impacting their ability to farm, travel, or generate income. The daily care of these animals was a constant chore, from watering and feeding them to mending fences and managing herds. And when an animal died, whether from disease, accident, or predation, it was a significant loss, both emotionally and economically, leaving a tangible void in the family's ability to survive. Let's further explore the nuanced aspects of social interaction and communication in this isolated world, an area where modern life offers such stark contrasts. The sheer difficulty of communication in the Wild West profoundly shaped community bonds and individual psyches. Imagine how much you rely on a quick text, an email, or a phone call to convey information or simply maintain connection. In the West, such ease was unimaginable. News spread by word of mouth, often slowly becoming distorted and embellished, with each retelling a historical game of telephone. Rumors and hearsay could travel faster than facts, sometimes with damaging consequences. This created a strong reliance on personal reputation and trustworthiness, as your word was often your only bond. When social gatherings did occur, whether a church service, a dance, or a communal barn raising, they were not just events. They were vital lifelines. These were opportunities for human connection that alleviated the profound loneliness. Think of the sheer joy and relief of seeing familiar faces, sharing stories, exchanging news, and simply being in the presence of others. Such moments were deeply cherished, their value magnified by their scarcity. People would travel for hours, sometimes days, to attend a social function, understanding that these fleeting moments of community were essential for mental and emotional well-being. The bonds forged in these settings were often incredibly strong, born of shared hardship and mutual dependence. The role of storytelling, both personal and communal, was also far more significant. With limited access to printed materials or other forms of entertainment, oral traditions thrived. Sitting around a campfire or a rough-hewn table, sharing tales of past adventures, triumphs, and tragedies, was not merely entertainment, but a way to transmit knowledge, reinforce cultural values, and process the often brutal realities of life. These were not just sleep stories, but living histories, shaping identities and understanding. The narratives of resilience against the elements, of narrow escapes from danger, of overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds, served to both entertain and inspire, building a shared sense of identity amongst those who chose to brave the frontier. Education, as we briefly touched upon, was a mosaic of formal and informal learning. Beyond the sporadic, often rudimentary schooling, practical education was continuous and lifelong. children learned essential skills directly from their parents and elders: how to farm, how to hunt, how to mend, how to cook, how to care for the sick. Girls learned complex domestic skills necessary for survival, transforming raw materials into clothing soap and preserved food. Boys learned about animal husbandry, carpentry, and the mechanics of farm equipment. This practical hands-on knowledge was often a matter of life and death, far more immediate in its importance than academic pursuits. The school of hard knocks was very real teaching lessons that stuck with you, often painfully. The concept of time off was almost non-existent. The rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the demands of subsistence. Planting season meant dawn to dusk labor, often without a break for weeks. Harvest season demanded similar intensity. Even during quieter periods, there were always chores: mending fences, repairing tools, chopping wood, preparing for the next season. The relentless cycle of work was a constant companion, demanding physical and mental endurance that would quickly exhaust most modern individuals. The idea of a vacation was an absurd fantasy. Travel was for necessity, not leisure, and rest was something snatched in moments between demanding tasks. Furthermore, the very nature of threat was different. It wasn't just human danger, but the omnipresent threat from the natural world. Wild animals, wolves, bears, mountain lions, rattlesnakes, were not distant exotic creatures seen in zoos, but potentially deadly neighbors. A single bite from a venomous snake or a mauling by a bear could be fatal miles from any help. The loss of livestock to predators could devastate a family's livelihood. Living in such close proximity to wild nature meant a constant vigilance, a heightened awareness of your surroundings that is largely absent from urban or suburban life today. You were not at the top of the food chain, but an integral part of a complex, often dangerous ecosystem. Let us now shift our focus to the very fundamental interactions of commerce and trade, which were vastly different from the streamlined, globalized systems we inhabit. Imagine a world without online shopping, without massive chain supermarkets, without a vast network of distributors and suppliers. In the Wild West, trade was largely localized, rudimentary, and often based on barter or the exchange of services rather than readily available cash. General stores were the lifeblood of most communities, acting as a microcosm of frontier commerce. These were often chaotic, overstuffed spaces, smelling of dried goods, kerosene, and unwashed humanity. Here you could find everything from basic foodstuffs like flour, sugar, and coffee to essential tools, bolts of rough fabric, and perhaps some limited medical supplies. The storekeeper, often a central figure in the community, might be the only source for many necessities. Their prices were often astronomical, reflecting the high cost of transportation and the risks involved in bringing goods to isolated settlements. You might pay significantly more for a bag of flour than it would cost back east, and your meager earnings would stretch a far shorter distance. Furthermore, credit was often extended, creating a complex web of debt between settlers and storekeepers. Many families lived perpetually on credit, settling their accounts only after a harvest or a successful hunting season, a precarious existence that made them vulnerable to crop failures or market fluctuations. Beyond the general store, specialized tradespeople were rare and highly valued. A blacksmith capable of forging tools, repairing wagons, and shoeing horses was an indispensable member of any settled community. A cooper who made barrels for storage and transport was equally essential. These skilled individuals often demanded payment in kind, trading their services for agricultural produce, animal hides, or other commodities, further illustrating the prevalence of a barter economy. The lack of readily available manufactured goods meant that self-reliance in crafting and repairing was not a hobby, but a necessity. If a tool broke, you either fixed it yourself, found someone who could, or did without. Consider the monetary system itself. While U.S. currency existed, its availability was often limited, and localized currencies, such as gold dust or even pelts, were common in specific regions, particularly in mining or fur trapping areas. Counterfeit currency was also a pervasive problem, making transactions inherently risky and requiring a keen eye for detection. Banking institutions were few and far between, and those that existed were often small, independent, and prone to failure, a significant risk for anyone attempting to save or invest their hard-earned money. The concept of secure financial transactions and insured deposits was decades away. Even the simple act of getting water, as touched upon earlier, highlights the vast differences. There was no municipal water system, no pipes delivering clean water directly to your home. If you lived near a stream or river, you hauled your water bucket by laborious bucket, often over significant distances. If you relied on a well, it was a constant chore to draw water, and the purity of the well was always a concern, easily contaminated by surface runoff or animal waste. Imagine the effort involved in simply hydrating yourself, your family, and your livestock every single day. The water wars that would later define much of the arid West had their genesis in this fundamental scarcity, highlighting the critical importance of this resource. The very concept of privacy, as we understand it, was almost non-existent. In small, often cramped dwellings, with multiple family members sharing a single room or sleeping area, personal space was a luxury. In close-knit, isolated communities, everyone knew everyone else's business, for better or worse. Your successes were celebrated, but your failures, your struggles, and your misfortunes were also widely known. While this fostered a strong sense of community support, it also meant a lack of anonymity, a constant social pressure to conform and contribute. There was little opportunity to retreat into one's private world as our modern society allows. The sensory experience of the frontier was not just about the omnipresent smells of grime and nature, but also the persistent sounds, or rather the striking lack of what we consider constant background noise today. Imagine the deep quiet of the rural West, broken only by the natural world. The rustle of wind through tall grass, the buzzing of insects, the distant cry of a coyote or an owl. At night, the chorus of crickets and frogs, the gentle murmur of a nearby stream, perhaps the subtle creaking of your wooden cabin. These were the dominant sounds, a stark contrast to the distant hum of traffic, the constant electronic pulses, or the myriad artificial noises that fill our modern soundscape. This profound auditory quiet could be unsettling to modern ears accustomed to constant input, but to the frontier dweller it was simply the sound of life. However, this quiet could be abruptly shattered by moments of intense natural sound. A sudden violent thunderstorm with booming thunder echoing across vast distances and torrential rain drumming against a thin roof would be an overwhelming sensory experience, far more immediate and visceral than anything you'd encounter from the safety of a modern home. The stampede of cattle, a terrifying roar of hooves and bellows, was an audible representation of danger and chaos. The crack of a rifle, the whinny of a startled horse, or the shouts of men during a cattle drive would cut through the silence with jarring intensity. These sound events were not just noise. They were often indicators of immediate danger or critical activity demanding full attention and rapid response. The visual landscape, too, was profoundly different. Imagine skies unmarred by light pollution, allowing the Milky Way to arc across the night in breathtaking clarity, a dazzling river of stars so bright it could cast shadows. This constant cosmic spectacle would have provided both inspiration and navigation, a humbling reminder of one's smallness in a vast universe. The absence of electricity meant nights were truly dark, save for the moon and stars, and perhaps the faint flickering glow of a distant campfire. This forced a different relationship with the night, often associated with mystery, danger, and a primal sense of vulnerability. The vastness of the landscape, the sheer unbroken horizons of the plains, or the towering, imposing peaks of the mountains would have created a different sense of scale. Your world was enormous, open, and untamed, reinforcing the sense of isolation, but also fostering a deep appreciation for the grandeur of nature. The colors would be more vivid, the air clearer, free from industrial smog or urban haze. The vibrant greens of spring, the golden hues of summer, the fiery reds and oranges of autumn, and the stark whites of winter snow would present a kaleidoscope of natural beauty unmediated by screens or filters. Consider the role of the frontier town saloon as a microcosm of leisure, or rather the limited scope of it. We discussed its dangers, but for many, it was the only public space available for social interaction and rudimentary entertainment. Beyond the dubious liquor, there might be card games, often high stakes, attracting both regulars and transient gamblers. A battered piano played by a traveling musician or a local with a knack for tunes might provide the background for crude dancing or melancholic songs. These were places where news was exchanged, deals were made, and disputes, both verbal and violent, often erupted. They were messy, vibrant, and dangerous hubs of frontier social life, far removed from the refined entertainment venues of the East. Even basic hygiene was a constant battle beyond just the monthly bath. The simple act of washing clothes was an arduous all-day affair involving boiling water over an open fire, scrubbing garments by hand with harsh lye soap, and wringing them out, a back-breaking process repeated for every family member's few sets of clothing. This was not a quick load in the washing machine. It was a physical ordeal contributing to the pervasive rough texture and often faded appearance of frontier attire. And personal grooming was minimal. Basic haircuts, shaves, and perhaps some simple folk remedies for skin ailments were the extent of it. The modern obsession with cleanliness, skincare, and elaborate personal care routines would have been utterly alien and frankly impossible. Let's expand on the concept of daily sustenance and its profound impact on health and well-being. The limited diet we touched upon previously wasn't just monotonous. It was a perpetual battle against the very real specter of malnutrition. Beyond scurvy, a host of other deficiencies plagued the frontier population. Lack of vitamin D from insufficient exposure to sunlight in winter or from limited dietary sources contributed to bone deformities and weakness. Iron deficiency was common, leading to pervasive fatigue and anemia, further debilitating individuals already exhausted by constant labor. The absence of diverse nutrients meant that bodies were constantly struggling, leaving them vulnerable to every passing infection. Food preparation itself was an enormous time-consuming task. There were no ready-made meals, no microwaves, no convenience foods of any kind. Every meal from scratch involved labor-intensive processes. Baking bread meant grinding grain, kneading dough, and tending a fire. Cooking meat involved arduous preservation methods like salting or smoking, followed by long cooking times to render it palatable. Imagine the constant foraging for wild edibles, the seasonal hunting, fishing, and gathering that supplemented the core staples demanding intimate knowledge of the local environment and its bounty. This wasn't a leisure activity. It was an essential part of the daily grind of survival. The concept of fresh, produce as we know it from refrigerated supermarkets, was almost entirely absent outside of a very brief growing season. Most of the year, your diet consisted of dried beans, cured meats, and whatever root vegetables could be stored in a root cellar, a dark, cool, often damp hole dug into the ground. Variety was a dream, not a reality. This limited diet directly impacted not just physical health, but mental well-being too. A poorly nourished body can significantly impact mood energy levels and cognitive function, adding another layer of challenge to an already arduous existence. Consider the very real threat of starvation. Crop failure due to drought, flood, or pests wasn't just an economic setback. It was a direct threat to life itself. If a farmer's yield was insufficient and they couldn't trade for enough to survive, the winter starvation was a grim, immediate possibility. This created an intense anxiety around food, a constant awareness of its fragility and preciousness, a far cry from the overflowing grocery aisles we take for granted. This precarious relationship with sustenance meant that food waste was almost unthinkable. Every scrap was utilized, every resource stretched to its absolute limit. The housing conditions, especially in the earliest stages of settlement, were a direct reflection of this scarcity and the pressing need for immediate shelter. Sod houses, while offering protection from the elements, were not built for comfort. They were often leaky, especially the roofs, and their earthen walls could crumble with prolonged rain. Log cabins, while sturdier, still required immense labor and skill to construct, and often featured wide gaps between logs, allowing drafts and insects to enter despite efforts at chinking. These were not cozy, charming retreats. They were basic, functional shelters, often shared by multiple family members, offering minimal privacy and constantly needing repair. The battle against the elements was waged not just outdoors, but within the very walls of your home. The concept of safety, as we define it today, with building codes, consumer protections, and extensive regulations, was non-existent. Every tool, every piece of equipment, every mode of transport was inherently dangerous. Farmers worked with sharp implements and powerful animals, often without adequate training or safety equipment. Miners faced daily risks from collapsing tunnels and toxic gases, their lives literally in the hands of rudimentary engineering and sheer luck. Even domestic tasks like cooking over an open flame or handling lye for soap making carried significant risks of burns or chemical exposure. Accidents were not just common. They were an accepted, almost inevitable part of life, and often resulted in permanent injury or death due to the lack of medical care. This constant exposure to danger, the implicit understanding that life was fragile and easily lost, must have fostered a deep fatalism and a profound quiet resilience in the frontier people. Let's expand on the concept of legal systems and the practical application of justice, moving beyond the simple good guys versus bad guys trope. The frontier was a fascinating, often contradictory laboratory for governance. The sheer vastness of the territories combined with sparse populations meant that formal law was often a distant whisper rather than a firm hand. The legal framework was a patchwork with federal, territorial, county, and local laws often overlapping, conflicting, or simply being unenforced. This legal ambiguity created fertile ground for disputes over land, water, and mining claims, often leading to protracted, bitter conflicts that were resolved through force rather than legal precedent. The role of the sheriff, or marshal, as we discussed, was incredibly demanding. They often served as prosecutor, judge, and executioner in one, their authority derived as much from personal reputation and a willingness to use force as from any legal mandate. Imagine trying to enforce laws across a territory the size of a modern state with just a horse, a gun, and perhaps a single deputy, often with no reliable communication or backup. This practical impossibility meant that large swaths of the frontier remained effectively lawless, governed only by the rough codes of honor or more often by brute force. Vigilante justice as a response to this vacuum could be seen as a desperate attempt at self-governance. These groups, often composed of prominent local citizens, would organize to punish perceived criminals, particularly in cases of cattle rustling or horse theft, which directly threatened the economic viability of the community. While some vigilante actions might have brought a semblance of order, the lack of due process, the quickness of judgment, and the inherent biases of small, isolated groups meant that innocent people were often punished, and personal grudges frequently settled under the guise of justice. The chilling reality of a mob descending upon an accused without trial or appeal was a very real fear, a dark stain on the history of frontier justice. Moreover, the frontier attracted those who actively sought to evade the law, outlaws, desperados, and individuals fleeing past misdeeds. For them, the West was a haven of anonymity and opportunity, where vast distances and limited law enforcement made it easier to disappear and reinvent oneself. This created a peculiar tension, a society ostensibly built on a desire for order and opportunity, yet simultaneously attracting those who thrived on chaos and exploitation. The economic landscape of the frontier also influenced legal and social structures. The boom and bust cycles of mining towns, the transient nature of cowboy work, and the precariousness of farming meant that populations were highly mobile. This constant flux made it difficult to establish stable communities, consistent legal systems, or enduring social norms. People came and went, chasing dreams or fleeing failures, leaving little behind but a faint imprint on the ever-moving frontier. This transience contributed to a sense of impermanence where short-term gain often trumped long-term sustainability. Even the architecture of the towns reflected this provisional nature. Many buildings were hastily constructed from cheap materials designed for immediate utility rather than permanence. They were often thrown up quickly to capitalize on a mining boom or a railroad expansion with little thought for future growth or infrastructure. This mirrored the transient mindset of many who populated these towns, seeing them as temporary stops on a journey rather than permanent homes. The role of disease as a factor of societal stress cannot be understated. Frequent outbreaks of cholera, smallpox, and typhoid, as discussed, decimated populations, but they also created profound social disruption. Entire families could be wiped out, leaving orphans and abandoned property. Communities would be fractured by fear and grief, their already fragile social fabric stretched to breaking point. The lack of medical understanding meant that superstitious beliefs and ineffective remedies often proliferated, adding to the general sense of helplessness and exacerbating public health crises. The emotional toll of constantly facing death, especially of children, profoundly shaped the frontier psyche, fostering a different, perhaps more stoic relationship with mortality. Life was cheap, and its end often abrupt and brutal. Let's now consider the psychological toll of the sheer unremitting effort required for everyday survival, a mental burden often overshadowed by the more dramatic dangers. Beyond the physical exhaustion, the constant need for vigilance, the endless array of tasks, there was a quiet, insidious weariness that permeated frontier life. The absence of readily available leisure or distraction meant that the mind, often overworked, had little opportunity to truly rest or engage in activities purely for pleasure. This constant state of on alert for threats, whether from the elements, wild animals, or human dangers, would likely lead to chronic stress and anxiety conditions that would be severely debilitating without modern coping mechanisms or therapeutic interventions. The struggle for basic needs, food, water, shelter, safety, was a daily, hourly preoccupation. Every decision from where to plant crops to where to dig a well carried immense weight. A wrong choice could mean hunger, illness, or even death. This constant high-stakes decision-making combined with the lack of safety nets created an environment of perpetual low-grade stress. There was no social security, no unemployment benefits, no public health system. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. This stark reality fostered an intense individualism, but also a deep, often unspoken understanding of just how fragile one's existence truly was. The concept of self-care, as understood in modern terms, activities designed to promote well-being and reduce stress, was entirely foreign. There was no time for meditation, no accessible forms of exercise beyond the daily grind of labor, no spa treatments, and certainly no organized support groups. Any respite came from hard-won moments of quiet reflection, brief periods of natural beauty, or the camaraderie of shared work and occasional social gatherings. The human spirit in this context had to be incredibly robust, capable of enduring immense psychological strain with very little external support. Furthermore, the lack of instant information and connection meant that people lived in a highly localized, often insular world. News from the outside world, when it arrived, was a distant echo often irrelevant to the immediate concerns of survival. This narrow focus could create a deep-seated provincialism where suspicion of outsiders and unfamiliar ideas was common. While this fostered strong community bonds among those who shared similar struggles, it also contributed to a lack of broader perspective and could make adaptation to change more difficult. The frontier was also a place where ingenuity was born of necessity. With limited tools, materials, and skilled labor, people had to become incredibly resourceful. Farmers invented new methods for breaking sod settlers, devised ingenious ways to catch rainwater, and communities collaborated to build structures that would have been impossible for individuals to complete alone. This resourcefulness is a testament to the human capacity for adaptation, a shining counterpoint to the relentless hardships. It highlights the power of necessity as the mother of invention and the remarkable ability of individuals to create solutions with limited means. The relationship with death, too, was far more intimate and immediate. Death was a frequent, inescapable part of life affecting every family and every community. Children died, young spouses perished from illness or accident, and friends were lost to violence or the elements. There was little opportunity for elaborate funerals or extended grieving periods. Bodies were often buried quickly, sometimes in unmarked graves, to allow the living to continue their fight for survival. This constant exposure to mortality must have fostered a different kind of stoicism, a hardened acceptance of fate, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the fleeting moments of life and connection. The profound grief, however, would always linger a quiet ache beneath the surface of daily tasks. As we draw towards the conclusion of our journey through the authentic Wild West, it's worth reflecting on the subtle, often unexamined impact of the environment on the human spirit and daily rituals. The vast open skies, whether blazing with the sun or glittering with countless stars, profoundly shaped the spiritual and psychological landscape of the frontier. Without the distractions of modern urban life, the immense expanse above was a constant, humbling presence, inspiring awe and contemplation. For many, it underscored a profound connection to a higher power, shaping religious beliefs and providing a sense of cosmic perspective amidst the earthly struggles. For others, it simply reinforced the sheer beautiful and terrifying vastness of the world, making individual concerns feel both immense and utterly insignificant. The daily rituals of life, though simple, were imbued with a deep significance. The the careful tending of a small garden, the daily milking of a cow, the methodical process of mending a fence. These weren't just chores. They were acts of survival, small victories against the overwhelming forces of nature. Each successful harvest, each animal brought safely through winter, was a testament to perseverance and a cause for quiet celebration. These repetitive tasks created a rhythm, a predictable framework in an unpredictable world, providing a sense of purpose and control in a life often governed by chance. This tangible connection to the fruits of their labor, the direct correlation between effort and sustenance, fostered a deep appreciation for the fundamental necessities of life that is often lost in our more specialized indirect economy. Consider the role of weaponry, not just for violence, but as a ubiquitous tool of daily life. Firearms were essential for hunting, providing vital protein to a monotonous diet. They were also necessary for defense against wild animals and, of course, human threats. Learning to use a rifle or a pistol was a fundamental skill as necessary as plowing a field or mending a shirt. The sound of a distant gunshot might signify a successful hunt, a warning, or a deadly conflict requiring an immediate assessment of the situation. This constant proximity to lethal force fostered a different kind of vigilance, an awareness that disputes could escalate quickly and irrevocably. The concept of leisure, as we discussed earlier, was transformed by necessity. Even card games or storytelling sessions were often accompanied by small tasks: mending, whittling, preparing supplies, blurring the lines between work and rest. There was no absolute separation, no distinct boundary between the demands of survival and the moments of relaxation. Entertainment was often practical honing skills or strengthening communal bonds rather than simply being a passive consumption of media. This fusion of work and play created a continuous integrated flow to life where every moment held potential for productivity or learning. Finally, the relentless cycle of boom and bust, particularly prevalent in mining and ranching areas, created its own unique social dynamics. The sudden influx of people during a gold rush would transform a quiet valley into a teeming, chaotic camp overnight, bringing with it both opportunity and lawlessness. When the vein ran dry or the cattle market collapsed, the population would just as quickly dissipate, leaving behind ghost towns and shattered dreams. This transience meant that communities were often fluid relationships, fleeting, and loyalty often limited to immediate companions. It fostered a hard-edged pragmatism, a willingness to pull up stakes at a moment's notice and move on to the next rumored opportunity rather than invest deeply in a single place. This constant impermanence contributed to the wildness of the West, resisting the settled order that slowly encroached from the East. Beyond the human interactions and the rhythm of daily toil, there lay a fundamental aspect of frontier life that shaped not just the physical landscape, but also the prevailing mindset. The relationship with nature often seen primarily as a resource to be exploited, not preserved. This frontier mentality was driven by immediate necessity and the prevailing ideology of manifest destiny, which viewed the vast untamed lands as a gift from Providence, ripe for conquest and development. The concept of ecological balance or long-term sustainability was largely absent from the common consciousness. Timber, for instance, was cut with little thought for regeneration. Vast forests were cleared for farmland, for building materials, or to fuel the steam engines that powered a growing nation. Game was hunted to near extinction, not just for food, but often for hides or sport, without any concept of sustainable management or wildlife conservation. Streams were diverted and polluted for mining operations. their pristine waters becoming murky with sediment and chemicals, their natural flows altered without regard for downstream consequences or broader ecological impact. The idea of conservation was simply not part of the common lexicon or practice. The land was there to be used, and its resources, seemingly endless, were there for the taking, a constant source of raw materials for a nation rapidly building itself. The near extinction of the American bison stands as a stark and tragic example of this exploitative approach and indeed of environmental warfare. From an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roaming the Great Plains in the 1700s, this magnificent animal, the very symbol of the American wilderness, was reduced to fewer than 1,000 individuals by 1884. This catastrophic decline was not solely driven by a demand for food or hides, though these were significant factors. It was also, chillingly, a deliberate U.S. government policy, a military strategy designed to deprive the Plains Indian tribes of their primary resource, their spiritual and physical lifeblood, thereby forcing them onto reservations and breaking their will to resist. The bison was central to the nomadic, self-sufficient way of life of many Native American nations, providing not just food, but also clothing, shelter, materials, tools, and deeply spiritual meaning. Eliminating the bison was a cold, calculated campaign of cultural eradication aimed at dismantling indigenous resistance by destroying their very means of existence. It reflected a mindset that viewed the land's resources as tools in a broader geopolitical conflict, rather than as integral parts of a complex ecosystem, and it remains one of the most poignant examples of human impact on the natural world during this era. This systematic destruction, alongside other narratives, also contributed to the genesis of the Wild West myths, and how they both reflected and more often profoundly distorted the reality of the frontier. The most intense period of myth-making surrounding the Wild West didn't occur during its raw, untamed height, but rather as the actual frontier was rapidly disappearing, receding before the advance of railroads and settled civilization. This was the era of figures like Buffalo Bill Cody, whose famous Wild West shows, beginning in the 1880s, brought staged reenactments of cowboy and Indian battles, sharpshooting displays, and simulated buffalo hunts to fascinated audiences in the East and Europe. These shows, while undeniably entertaining and wildly popular, were not accurate historical depictions. They were carefully curated spectacles designed to resonate with existing romanticized ideas about the West, shaping public perception far more profoundly than any dry historical account ever could. Alongside these grand spectacles, dime novels emerged as a powerful force in shaping the frontier narrative. These inexpensive, mass-produced paperbacks originated in Eastern publishing houses, written by authors who often had little, if any, first-hand experience of the West. Their stories were formulaic, designed for maximum escapism and easy consumption, emphasizing action-adventure and clear moral distinctions between heroes and villains. They portrayed the West as a grand testing ground for quintessential American virtues: self-reliance, rugged individualism, courage in the face of danger, and the triumph of good over evil. The lone cowboy, the heroic sheriff, the savage Indian, these archetypes were born and solidified in the pages of these sensationalized tales, becoming deeply ingrained in the American psyche. Later, the burgeoning Hollywood westerns further refined and amplified these mythological elements, creating a powerful, enduring narrative that, while captivating, bore little resemblance to the complex, often messy historical reality. These myths, captivating as they were, served powerful psychological and cultural functions for a rapidly changing nation. They offered reassuring narratives about American identity during periods of immense social upheaval, industrialization, and nascent international challenges. At a time when traditional ways of life were being swept away by progress, the frontier myth suggested that the fundamental American character was forged in the crucible of these wild conditions, producing exceptional qualities of resilience, ingenuity, and moral fortitude. The stories implied that American expansion was not just a historical event, but an inevitable and morally justified process, a triumphant march of civilization over wilderness and progress over primitive cultures. They presented simplified moral frameworks where good inevitably triumphed through righteous violence, subtly justifying America's growing power and its often brutal methods of expansion. It was a comforting story, easy to understand, with clear heroes and villains and a predictable, satisfying ending. However, what these pervasive myths often obscured was the far more complex, morally ambiguous reality of Western development. They conveniently swept under the rug the horrifying genocide of indigenous peoples, reducing their suffering to mere obstacles in the path of progress, as if their disappearance was a natural, inevitable consequence rather than a deliberate, brutal campaign. The myths ignored the brutal exploitation of immigrant labor. The Chinese railroad workers, the Mexican miners, and the European laborers, who built the West with their sweat and blood, but were often denied dignity rights and fair compensation. They overlooked the widespread environmental devastation that accompanied settlement, the unthinking consumption of resources, the destruction of ecosystems that had thrived for millennia, driven by a short-sighted focus on immediate gain. The myths failed to acknowledge the corporate manipulation of political systems, the immense power wielded by railroad barons, mining magnates, and cattle kings who shaped laws and policies to their own benefit, often at the expense of the common settler, consolidating wealth and power in ways that undermined the very spirit of individual opportunity. Furthermore, the myths largely ignored the deeply divided communities that struggled with fundamental questions of identity governance and resource allocation. The real West offered no simple moral lessons or clear-cut answers. Instead, it presented a complex case study in how human societies adapt to overwhelming challenges, sometimes with incredible cooperation, ingenuity, and community spirit, but just as often with exploitation, greed, and brutal violence. The narrative of the Wild West then became a carefully constructed fiction serving a national purpose rather than reflecting a complete historical truth. It shaped perceptions for generations, creating a romanticized vision that was both deeply appealing and profoundly misleading, continuing to influence our understanding even today. The enduring legacy of the Wild West, therefore, extends far beyond the realm of popular mythology. It continues to cast a long shadow, influencing not just our cultural narratives, but also the very structures of modern America. Many of our current property laws, for instance, particularly in Western states, have their roots in the haphazard and often contentious land claims of the frontier era. The frameworks for water rights, particularly crucial in the arid West, were forged in an age of scarcity and fierce competition, and their complexities continue to shape environmental policy and economic development today. Even the federal-state relationships, the balance of power between central government and regional authorities, were profoundly impacted by the challenges of governing vast, often rebellious territories. And our national approach to natural resources, oscillating between exploitation and conservation, finds its historical precedent in the choices and struggles of the frontier era, from the clear-cutting of forests to the establishment of the first national parks. Moreover, the incredible diversity of Western communities, though often marked by conflict, ultimately contributed to the multicultural reality of modern America. The confluence of indigenous nations, European immigrants, Black Americans, and Mexican communities created a vibrant, if often tumultuous, cultural mixing pot that laid the groundwork for the complex tapestry of identities that define the nation today. And the continuing tensions that we grapple with between individual rights and collective welfare, between local control and national directives, and indeed between the exploitation of resources and their careful conservation, all have deep historical roots in the very questions and struggles that confronted frontier societies. The West, in many ways, was a laboratory for American identity, and the experiments conducted there continue to inform our national character, whether we realize it or not. As we gently fade from the dusty trails and harsh realities of the Wild West, allowing the sounds of distant coyotes and creaking wagons to recede, let your mind drift back to the quiet comfort of your own space. You are no longer navigating muddy streets or fearing a harsh winter, but perhaps nestled warmly secure in the knowledge of hot running water, plentiful food, and the soft hum of modern life. The challenges of the frontier, though fascinating to explore, are a world away from the gentle, supportive cradle of your present. Imagine the vast, silent night sky that stretched over those pioneers, the same stars that now glitter above you, providing a timeless, peaceful connection. They witnessed every struggle, every triumph, every quiet moment of human perseverance. Their experiences, etched into the landscape and the very fabric of history, remind us of the profound resilience of the human spirit and the extraordinary journey from a raw, untamed world to the one of relative ease we inhabit today. Let any lingering thoughts of grit and hardship soften into a gentle appreciation for your quiet comforts. The distant echoes of the past are fading, dissolving into the gentle rhythm of your own breath. You are safe, you are warm, and the long, difficult day of the frontier has given way to your tranquil night. Allow your mind to release the last vestiges of history, to let the details blur, and to sink deeper into the embrace of peaceful sleep. The Wild West, in all its stark beauty and brutal reality, will remain waiting quietly for another exploration. But for now, it is time for rest.